Okay, well, we are at the 12 o'clock hour, so I think maybe what we'll do, we've got people that are going to continue to stream in and join us, but to be respectful of the hour that we'll be together today, we wanted to get started. So good afternoon, everybody. My name's Karen Edwards, and I'm the director of the Community University Partnership for the Study of Children, Youth, and Families, otherwise known as CUP. And I'm so pleased to welcome you to the first field expert talk in CUP's Issue and Impact series. So a little housekeeping for our time together today. We've muted everybody's mics and turned off your cameras, so it's easier for our speakers to be seen and heard. But if you want to pin the speaker so that you can view Shannon, Shannon, if you wave your hand, she's at the very front of what you will see. So that's Shannon, and if you go to Shannon's picture and actually click on the little 3 dots, you'll see that you can actually pin her if you'd like to as your main speaker for the moment. Before I get too far though into our session, I want to take a moment to recognize and speak to the land that we're meeting on today. And even though the current state of the world is pushing us into a virtual and seemingly disconnected environment of Zoom, it's important to pause and recognize the land on which we're meeting. Depending on where you're calling in from today, our group may reach across the traditional territories of many nations. And honoring the land we're on and the footsteps that have walked the lands before us not only grounds us, but acknowledges the importance of relationships, all forms of relationships. I specifically want to acknowledge the wisdom relationships in land on which I am standing today, and I encourage you to do the same. I am on Treaty 6 land, a traditional meeting ground and traveling route for many Indigenous people. Through our acknowledgement of this territory, we respect the histories, languages, and cultures of First Nation, Métis, Inuit, and all First Peoples of Canada, whose presence continues to enrich our vibrant communities. A treaty is an inheritance, a responsibility, and a relationship. May recognizing our status as treaty people help us be good neighbors to one another, good stewards of the land, and good ancestors to all our children. I'd also like to take a brief moment to recognize the organizational transition that CUP has gone through this past year. We're celebrating our 20th anniversary this year, which is incredibly exciting. And we've also moved faculties. And in both of these milestones, we've been reminded of all the community and university partners who've played a critical role in CUP's journey. I want to extend a huge thanks to each and every one of you. We will share a celebration of our anniversary by releasing our 20th anniversary annual report this week, which is entitled Weaving Collaborations for 20 Years. And I also want to extend a heartfelt thank you to CUP's staff, faculty, and steering committee members for their support over the past year through moves, anniversaries, and of course, responding to COVID. This year's been a doozy. I also offer a special thank you to the Faculty of Extension and Interim Dean, Dr. Maria Mann, for providing CUP with a home for the past 12 years that has allowed us to flourish. And on behalf of Dr. Mann and myself, I want to thank Dr. Shanthy Johnson, Dean of the School of Public Health, for taking such good care of CUP and its people as we've transitioned into the School of Public Health. I'd like to invite Dr. Johnson to provide a few words of welcome to the group.
Thank you, Karen. On behalf of the School of Public Health, let me add my very warm welcome to everyone who's joined us today. The Community University Partnership, as Karen talked about, for the study of children, youth, and families is a very unique collaboration among the University of Alberta, community agencies, and organizations in and around Edmonton and across Alberta, committed to improving the development of children, youth, and families by creating or mobilizing evidence-based knowledge that impacts programs and policies. It is with my great pride that I acknowledge 20 years of CUP's impactful work connecting the community and the university on key health and social issues, keeping children, youth, and families at the heart of it all. Can you imagine a community without children, youth, or families? They are the core of the healthy and resilient communities we need now more than ever. My heartiest congratulations to CUP on the 20th anniversary. To celebrate this special milestone, CUP has launched this series, very appropriately termed as Issues and Impacts, and to promote virtual conversations and experiences, even amidst these extraordinary circumstances that has affected us all. And so congratulations to the team. We are all here to hear the first of the series today, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing Dr. Shannon Sanchez-Youngman in just a few moments, and she'd talk about community-based participatory action research, and there'll be a bit more by way of introduction. In July of this year, as Karen alluded to, CUP became part of the School of Public Health due to some institutional changes at the University of Alberta. And it's been my absolute pleasure to welcome CUP and the associate faculty members to the Faculty of Extension to be part of the School of Public Health. We are delighted at the additional synergies created through CUP now that CUP is part of the School of Public Health. We have grounding of values in terms of social justice, community connections, engaged scholarship, lots of those ingredients that are really, really critical to move the needle on big challenges ahead of us. Authentic and strategic engagement and partnership has also been identified as our school's strategic priority goal. And this is very, very important and timely. And I would like to take this opportunity to recognize the founding members for their vision and commitment for creating this amazing Community University Partnership Alliance, some of whom who still continue to serve on the steering committee today, and kudos and congratulations and thanks to them for your commitment to CUP and to this very important partnership. I would also like to thank the former Dean Katie Campbell, who was the Dean for CUP for many, many years, and Interim Dean Maria Mayan from the Faculty of Extension for their incredible commitment, leadership, and support to not only CUP as a structure and organization, but to the cause of CUP. Finally, I want to say that these have been extraordinary times, and it's been incredibly challenging for individuals and families, as we are hearing in the media and experiencing in our circle of relationship and families. We are seeing issues we already knew existed in the system amplified, and I'm hopeful that these conversations that we are having through these series are not only going to make us think about them more, but bring the collective resolve to creating the change that we want to see. That is so critical for propelling conversations to collective actions. And together, as Community University Partnership, we can do great things in creating healthier and resilient societies and communities. And so with that, I want to again congratulate the CUP and the staff and all of the people who've had touch points with that core theme of Community University Partnership from the inception till today, and want to thank others who would come on board as part of the journey and evaluation of addressing critical public health issues. So thank you and welcome everyone to this virtual presentation.
Thanks so much, Shanti. Well, it's time to get started. So today, as Shanti said, we kick off our Issues and Impacts series. Normally in the fall, we would host an in-person celebration event, but this year, for obvious reasons, we can't. But we're using this year and our anniversary as an excuse to extend this celebration. So over the next 12 months, we will bring you the CUP Issues and Impacts series. Each segment of the series engages field experts and CUP's local research partnerships to discuss issues that are relevant to the well-being of children, youth, families, and communities. Field experts speak to a current issue of concern related to one of CUP's priority research areas, and then local partnerships will provide a more intimate discussion of local projects working to understand and achieve impacts on the same issue. Today, we start with the issue of community-based participatory research as a tool for policy change with Dr. Shannon Sanchez-Youngman and her talk of leveraging CBPR practices to advance system and policy changes for health and social justice. Dr. Sanchez-Youngman is a community-based participatory researcher with expertise in Latino mental health disparities, intervention research, and health equity policy. She has over 20 years of experience developing community health interventions aimed at reducing social and health disparities among economically marginalized groups and racial and ethnic groups in the United States. She seeks to bridge the gap between social science theories and methods with multi-level health intervention research. She received her doctorate at the University of New Mexico in political science and is currently the Associate Director for Participatory Research and Evaluation at the Center for Participatory Research. And she's the Doctoral Fellowship Director for the Center for Social Policy at the University of New Mexico. She was also a doctoral fellow at the Robert Wood Johnson Center for Health Policy from 2010 to 2015. I am super excited to welcome you today, Shannon. Over to you.
Thank you. And I just want to extend my warm welcome to everyone over Zoom. I happen to be a very short woman. Usually when I give a talk, people can barely see me over the podium. So for once in my life, I think you can all really see my face, and I'm very excited about that. So what I'm going to start with is I'm going to share my slides. I'm going to share my screen, and we will begin. Okay. So I have a very short time with you today, but I have three major objectives in my talk, and I've listed them here. The first thing I want to do is talk about the landscape of CBPR as a strategy to influence policy change. I'm going to talk about how this has sort of emerged, particularly in the context that I know best, the United States. And then I'm going to talk and demonstrate that CBPR also represents a much broader social movement that is aiming to scale up and work towards achieving health equity. Goodness. And finally, I'm going to conclude my short talk by elaborating some case studies that I've been involved with that highlight the promise and barriers of policy advocacy and social transformation. Excuse me. I'm going to grab some water. So just to ensure that we're all on the same page, I come at this as a political scientist. And as political scientists, we become obsessed with operational definitions. But I just thought I'd put up a bit of the terms that I'm using today. So when we think of public policy, in very simple terms, we imagine public policy to be a course of action that is often adopted and pursued by government. When we think of a fuller definition of public policy, what I mean is this requires a purposive and consistent course of action that's produced as responsive to a perceived problem that is experienced by various constituencies, that is formulated by specific political processes, and that is often adopted and implemented and enforced by a public agency. So oftentimes when people start thinking about public policy, they often think of formal laws and passing them. But when we really stop and imagine public policy, it encompasses a wide number of systems, constituencies, and actions that are leveraged to pursue some sort of collective good. So when we imagine CBPR and its impact on policy, there's a wide range of ways that we're seeing CBPR partnerships actively engage in this arena. And just before I move forward, when I think of policies, there's a myriad of policies that one could think of. Sometimes people think about policy as the difference between big P policy and little policy. I tend to think about policy across multiple categories. This can include things like distributive policies that often include the allocation of services and benefits, all the way to things like redistributive policies that are much more deliberate in shifting the allocation of wealth, income, and property rights. In the realm of CBPR, when you look at the field as a whole and how policy work is being applied, you can see that partnerships are engaged in a massive number of categorical ways to influence, create policies. So why should people in CBPR care about policy? Well, you're in a college, or you're in a school of public health. We know that public health has a vested interest and inherent focus on social change. So it makes sense that those of us that have been involved in community engaged research would adopt taking a policy advocacy point of view. What we're seeing in the field is that increasingly CBPR partnerships are not only linking research to the policy level, but they are also doing this in a way as a means to take their work to scale to eliminate health disparities. Much more recently, CBPR policy research and action has offered a much more expanded mechanism to link social justice and health equity principles through policy-directed action. So what do I mean here? What I'm pointing you to here is that there's been some very important work done by close colleagues of mine, Lisa Kakari-Stone, Nina Wallerstein, and Meredith Meekler in the US. And what I'm showing you here is an important article that I think everyone should read about the link between CBPR research and health equity. And what this article does is it begins to talk about how do we create a conceptual model that bridges CBPR practices with creating policy change. A lot of times when people think of CBPR research, we're thinking of research that involves community members in all stages of the research process. When people are beginning to use CBPR in policy advocacy work, they're linking these kinds of practices to say, how do researchers and community stakeholders not only produce cutting-edge evidence, but how do they leverage their partnerships to influence both formal and informal policymaking processes? So in the first stage of this kind of work, we've seen that CBPR plays an important role that has linked scientific evidence to policy reform. Some common examples of this include things like partnerships in environmental health policy, who have leveraged data collected by community members to advocate for reforms in environmental policy. But what we've learned from some of these early approaches is that there is sometimes a fundamental disconnect between policymakers and researchers, right, in what counts as evidence. And we've certainly seen that play out, particularly in the United States with COVID, as we've had political actors who've even denied the importance of scientific evidence. And we also know that oftentimes just simply highlighting research or evidence often competes with very real world events and the politics of health policy making. So to bridge this gap, people are increasingly calling for research itself to be shepherded through the political process. That is, effective CBPR partnerships are not just going out and collecting the data in partnership with community stakeholders, but they are actually getting an increasing role in civic engagement and political participation to influence outcomes. So, in order to get more political, what we're finding is there's important strategies that CBPR partnerships can undertake to facilitate policy-oriented outcomes. And I would argue there's two pathways that one could essentially take in order to accomplish this. First, what we're finding in the field is that many partnerships leverage coalitions and use traditional policy advocacy strategies to influence policy outcomes. They do things like raise awareness about the social determinants of health. They document health inequities and elaborate them in legislative hearings or in public events. They also have increasingly used strategies like engaging marginalized populations in policymaking. A very common strategy that we see here used here in both the United States and New Mexico is working with communities who are affected by things such as, let's say, racial discrimination, for them to come to the table and tell their stories and share their lived experiences as a strategy to set different policy agendas, for example. And we've also seen over the last 10 years, many partnerships who engage in a lot of capacity building, both with community members and academic members alike, to increase folks' ability to influence policies. So for example, we've seen a growth of institutes that teach both researchers and grassroots advocates how to do things like write policy briefs so that they can get the word out about their policy actions. But in addition to these traditional policy advocacy efforts, we're seeing a new generation of CBPR researchers, both in the United States and internationally, begin to engage in deeper resistance strategies that are much more aimed at tackling health inequities and towards reaching deeper social justice aims. So in a minute, I'm going to share with you some movement building that's been going on between coalitions and community members in various parts of the United States, grassroots organizing, and the increasing use of even protest politics to advance policy change. So as I started to get at with some of these strategies, we see that in the traditional policy space, that CBPR has become an effective strategy to facilitate social change, both at the local level and at sometimes the national level in the United States. We see that CBPR contextualizes health inequities, and it's also created processes that promote social justice. So you'll see here in this slide, I'm giving you two small examples of how this has happened. The first slide relates to a project in Northern California in San Francisco that entailed a long-term partnership between a medical team and various community organizers working in the San Francisco Chinatown district. Originally, a lot of this partnership work has been centered around obesity and alleviating kind of practices related or promoting healthy practices to curtail diabetes. But as the partnership has developed over time, what began to unfold through their work is that many people are eating unhealthy in this district, not because they're making bad food choices, but because people are living on low wages. So to remediate this issue, what this particular partnership did is they enacted an undercover study in which they went in and documented how local businesses in the region were committing what was called wage theft. And through this process, they were able to advocate and set fairer wage practices in local government. So in this example, you see that how a project that was set around a categorical health issue built capacity over time to dig into and try and remediate some of those social determinants of health by fighting for social justice reforms. So that's one example of how we are seeing long-term partnerships in the United States not only attack and think about health disparities, but how they're translating it and partnering and scaling out for broader reform. In more recent work that I've been doing with colleagues in New York, New Mexico, and with Nina Wallerstein more nationally, what we're beginning to see is that the cutting edge work around CBPR and policy is beginning to undertake a broader social movement approach to influencing both policy change and wider social transformation. So we're in the middle of writing a big paper that says that CBPR is emerging as a new kind of social movement that not only leverages evidence, but uses the principles of CBPR to really begin to rethink how scientists, grassroots advocates, and even some traditional governmental organizations can really make broader shifts, not only in regards to narrow policy change, but at broader cultural change in the United States and elsewhere. So when I think of CBPR as a social movement, I'm thinking that many partnerships, while they may write policy briefs and support efforts to advocate for formal policy change, we're seeing increasing research partnerships do things like align with Black Lives Matter in the United States to call for the dismantling of systemic racism. In some places with Latino populations that I work with a lot, we're seeing increasing partnerships form with farm workers groups to not only uncover the effects of unfair labor practices on mental health or physical health, but then to leverage these partnerships to advocate for bigger reforms, both formally and through cultural practices. So when we're thinking about CBPR as a social justice movement, what we're seeing is that partnerships are engaging in a variety of social justice strategies to achieve these efforts. And what I've done for you here is I've given you just a very simple definition of multiple dimensions of justice that we see being pursued by a variety of partnerships throughout the United States. And rather than go through this, I'll just take one and show you an example. So commonly we think of distributive justice when we think about the work that we can do to use CBPR to advocate for change. And all this means is that this element of social justice is looking for the right to equal treatment and equal access to the same distribution of goods and services. So for example, a common practice that we've seen emerge locally and diffuse throughout cities in the United States is that in neighborhoods that are mostly populated by fast food restaurants and liquor stores, there's been enormous efforts and positive changes in the provision of fresh food in grocery stores regardless of the neighborhood. So we see a range of these kinds of strategies that CBPR partnerships are using to advance reform. So I just thought I'd share with you a quick example to kind of bring to light some of what I'm talking about. I know that sometimes as a political scientist, I can get caught up in being obtuse and abstract. So sometimes hearing an example really drives the point home. So the Bronx Health Reach is a partnership in the Bronx, New York, that's been in existence for over 20 years. This is a partnership that encompasses over 70 African-American churches and Latino churches and an array of organizations that initially came together to really look at and try and remediate disparities in healthcare access among African Americans and Latinos in the Bronx, New York, and to also look at growing disparities in heart disease among those populations. And they were witnessing growing and increasing rates of obesity with African Americans and Latino populations there. So under a variety of funding sources, this project has really, has engaged in multi-level strategies to not only work on solving health disparities through categorical health interventions, but they have worked hard to fight for various forms of justice using a wide array of strategies that I discussed earlier. So for example, they worked towards advocating for distributive justice through a variety of efforts in which they worked with local grocers and local policies to do tax incentive policies that did things that called for adopting a bodega. And what that simply meant is they provided tax incentives. They worked with local government to provide tax incentives to install proper freezers and refrigerators in local bodegas so that they could carry fresh fruits and vegetables. On a much grander scale, they were able to achieve through their coalitional work and through direct pressure legislatively to move in New York public schools, they moved from whole milk and sweetened milk to low-fat milk in schools. Now, I don't know about you, but to accomplish a policy reform like that in a city like New York, that's a massive undertaking. They also called for things like structural justice. In addition to running healthy eating programs out of local churches and helping sign people up for Medicaid benefits, they actually went to the New York state politics and began to do protests and began to reveal how the lack of access to healthcare services in their mind was medical apartheid. They also worked on a number of strategies that attempted to remediate injustices that were rooted in social and cultural identity domination, and began to do things in local churches like reclaim images of what health and beauty meant with African American women, noting that oftentimes that the ideal image of beauty in American culture is often a white, thin woman. So as you see here, The Bronx Health Reach program is this incredible example of how a long-term partnership was able to work at multiple levels to influence a variety of policy levers to raise awareness and to really create an agenda that was meeting the localized needs of residents in the Bronx and in the United States. Okay. So I want to talk in conclusion. Karen, how much time do I have left?
You've got about 4 or 5 minutes left.
Okay, 4 or 5 minutes left. Okay, so I skipped a few things. So when I talk to you about the Bronx Project, I think that can be very overwhelming for people because the Bronx Health Reach Project is a project that was well funded. It had a strong coalition. It had years of working together. But I show people that example because as you're embarking and thinking about, okay, how can I leverage my CBPR work to think about how we get more involved in advocating for upstream reforms? Cases like that are really good because they show us the myriad of strategies that one can employ, okay? So my intent there is for you to take that and think in just small ways. How can you and your partners, or how can CUP leverage its institutional role with early childhood policy to think more broadly about how they can influence change across a range of outcomes? But I want to conclude with a much smaller partnership that helps us understand some of the pitfalls that can be involved in this work. And in this partnership, this was a partnership in New Mexico. It involved a number of partners. It included people from the academic center of UNM, so researchers. It also included local public health county officials who were very, very committed to thinking about environmental justice in the South Valley. And it also encompassed an array of community groups who were very interested in organizing local promotoras to engage in policy dialogue and policy reform in the South Valley. Now, all of these people came together and they were funded under an environmental health grant because in this particular area of New Mexico, there is a mixture of farmland as well as a high number of Superfund sites. And the project came together in hopes of really influencing land use policy locally in the area. And I've given you a picture here so that you can see what the area looks like. This is a semi-rural area. It's a very old New Mexican community. It includes some families that are recent immigrants, but most of the New Mexican families have lived here for generations. And in our culture, we are often united by what we call acequias or ditches. Ditches have been sort of the way in which water is distributed in our very arid and dry community. So just to understand a little bit about the socio-political context here, in New Mexico, there is a lot of activism around land grants that were given to our state when we were still part of Mexico. So a number of families were given land grants and communities came together and survived in this way and used things like farming and acequias to really build a strong community infrastructure. As I said earlier, there's a high number of Superfund sites in this area. As things have modernized, this particular community has become much poorer. And so it's become widely used as a dump site. And in New Mexico in general, we have a strong politics of patronage. That is, we're a majority minority state, which means that most of us are Latino. And families have been involved for generations in both local and state level politics. In our state, we have a lot of interesting relationships between race, class, and gender. Oppression is often linked to land access and citizenship rights. And our racial and ethnic hierarchies really vary according to one's citizenship status, who identifies as a Spanish family, and those who claim Mexican heritage. And finally, at the partnership level here, this was a newly emerging partnership that included very strong factions in the research team. There was a faction of county policymakers. There was another faction of community-based organizations and promotoras. And there was a research team that was really stuck on making sure that they could collect evidence to satisfy their grant requirements. So what happened in this partnership? A major aspect of this partnership's failure to move forward was that each of these factions really had different conceptions over the meaning of environmental justice here. Okay? So among the county officials who were dedicated progressives, who really wanted to see the reduction of Superfund sites in the area, they found that culturally, many of the organizations that worked in this arena were male dominant, that they had bias and attitudes in females, and that in politics, there was a very male dominant in power, and oftentimes politics were run through backdoor deals. So for this group of white progressives, they were frustrated that they were working in what they viewed as a corrupt political process. On the other side of the continuum, community health workers and local CBOs really felt that the white progressives in the partnership really didn't understand what water meant in this community. And here's one quote that kind of illustrates the point. They said, "For me, the acequia movement is another movement of struggle altogether that is currently happening. There is the association of acequias, because with a water problem, it's a movement based on tradition. It's a New Mexican movement, the struggle for water, that water is life. For us, se defiende, no se vende. Water is to defend and not to sell. But in contrast, for those policymakers, the goal of this policy program was to do things like teach the community conservation techniques." So this led to a lot of conflicting strategies for change that ultimately led to the disruption of the partnership and a lack of political movement. And as you see here, what we note in this case study is that for academic and policy partners, their approach was very cautionary, and it remained grounded in the science of public health. They thought that this was an opportunity to teach community members to simply gather data and to bring evidence to action in a very linear way. Community partners, on the other hand, had a much more radical lens. And for them, water represented a way of life. It was not just a way to conserve or to move towards environmental protection, but this is very much the way communities organized and centered cultural practices. For them, the purpose of the partnership was to facilitate critical consciousness among allies, and they preferred conflict strategies to advance policy change. So why am I telling you all this? I've given you a sad story to end. I'm telling you this because when you engage and you really are serious about thinking about how do you take a CBPR framework and apply it to real policy change or social justice, these are the kinds of issues that often unfold. It doesn't mean that they're not solvable, but it means that in order to successfully apply CBPR values and principles, these are precisely the kinds of tensions and hard decisions that authentic partnerships engage in as they move down this road together. So I think I've taken more time than I was allotted, and I'll stop there, Karen.
That's awesome, Shannon. Thank you so much. My wheels are turning lots. What I want to say to everybody is that we're going to take questions now for Shannon. If you want to filter your questions through the chat box, of course, your chat box is along the bottom of your screen, so please feel free to hit that. You'll have seen some earlier messages that are in there. And maybe what I'll do is lean in a little bit and start the questions myself. And thinking, you gave some incredible case study examples of projects and partnerships that leaned into different forms of policy influence. And I'm curious because the conflict that you shared in your last partnership example, which maybe didn't turn out the way exactly everybody had hoped it might. I'm curious in that navigation between the immediacy and that need within community and the balance on the other side of you likened it as that more linear thinking, like we need all of the evidence and we need it laid out very neatly and lovely. I think anybody involved in CUP work would say, yep, we're right there right now. Yep, we're feeling that. So can you comment to that push pull? I mean, those are the points of tension, and sadly in your latter case, it didn't turn out well. And we know what those spaces feel like, but I wonder if you can maybe address that topic a little bit more. Do you have, I'm sure you had a roster of case studies that you were thinking of drawing from, and I'm curious about what that, if you can comment a little bit more to that push pull between those types of.
Absolutely, I'm happy to do so. And in fact, I'm doing some work in northern New Mexico that started around suicide prevention. It's a YPAR project. It's Youth Participatory Action Research, and we're involved. There's youth stakeholders, and we have a county health council who's very involved. And in this particular project, what's happening is we're doing digital storytelling with youth, and they're beginning to uncover all of these interesting themes and actions they want to partake in to deal with stigma. And it's making a lot of the adults in the Health Coalition very nervous because it's not falling in line with their vision of developing new programs and services. So we're kind of working through this now. So one thing that we're really doing, and I think this is about, how do you redress power relations and CBPR partnerships? So some of it is about having carefully negotiated discussions between the stakeholders in the room about, some mainstream evidence-based practices that one arm of the project is pursuing, but then also allowing the space for these teen activists, as they're becoming, to really pursue something a little more radical. So in this instance, what we're doing is, while I'm actively involved in the legislative cycle right now, advocating for more money to fund this kind of prevention work, our youth leaders are hosting a series of policy, we're calling them policy speak back sessions with adults, so that they can do some agenda setting work and work towards these deeper social transformation goals. So I think, this is hard to do. I'm doing this with National Institute of Health funded research. And the part that I'm doing on the side with the teens is not something NIH cares about. So it's a balancing of those things. But I'm learning, at least in my own work, that it's important to kind of have those discussions and figure out how you can do things that are multi-pronged. And when you can't, you really have to be clear about it. Part of what happened in the South Valley Partnership is that people had competing agendas, and there was a complete lack of transparency about what those agendas were, and it eventually blew up. So, for me, and I didn't have a lot of time today, what I would say is that this is where, power sharing, mutual decision making, and having a strong advisory group is really important, because it allows that space for everyone to be making decisions together. I think, as oftentimes academics and policymakers end up making most of the decisions.
Thanks very much. I have a question here. It says, I've heard a lot about restorative justice during the Black Lives Matter movement. How did that impact your research, or will it impact your research moving forward?
Thank you for that question. I mean, yeah, restorative justice, I would, and Canada, Canada's work with CBPR in many ways, Nina Wallerstein and I feel, is way ahead of ours. So we have as much to learn from you as you have to learn from us. But restorative justice is, it is becoming widely used in a number of arenas in the United States. In my own work, I do a lot of work around structural racism, but of course I work with Latino populations. And Latino populations, first of all, Latinos are not heterogeneous in the United States, and their experience with racialization is complicated. It's just a complicated. So for example, in New Mexico, where I do a lot of work, there's a lot of healing that has to occur between new immigrants and longstanding Latinos who've been in New Mexico a long time. So a lot of my work is about how do you reconcile and remediate some of those histories and current oppressions within Latinos. So I do incorporate it in, but it's for those of you who want to do it, that's just long-term work. But I do incorporate it a lot into what I do.
I'll follow that up with something I see in the chat box from Bethan, who's part of CUP as well. It's interesting to me in your example that those who work at the structural and institutional levels are more resistant to the radical and the need to shift critical consciousness than the people closer to the issue, although that's not surprising. We talk about power sharing and CBPR principles, but they don't necessarily translate in practice. Based on your experience, how do we navigate those group dynamics when there are conflicting interests?
That is such a good question. I don't know who said that, but that's like, that to me, that's like at the heart of everything. Well, so in my work with Engage for Equity, which is, Nina Wallerstein has been leading this effort, and I'm a co-PI on this grant. What we've been very interested in that project is what are the promising practices that get at this? And we actually have a paper coming out. We have surveyed over 450 partnerships in the United States who are doing CBPR work. And what we're finding is that when partnerships actually share governance, and we have a whole measure in which we've looked at this. When partnerships share money, so there's certain things that really matter. And one of it is sharing resources. We find that as that increases, outcomes get better. We find that when leadership is shared, that these outcomes get better. So we call this structural governance. And so my words to you is there's multiple ways that power sharing occurs. One very simple one is for academics to give up some of their decision-making power. It's hard to do. You know, I'm in a partnership now. I'm sharing the decision-making on our budget. That's hard to do. But there are practices in play, and we are showing evidence that they actually lead to better outcomes long-term than partnerships who don't do those practices. So if you're interested in more of that, I can give you all kinds of citations. We have a bunch of work coming out on that right now.
And here's maybe one more question for you. How do we build our comfort with power, given that power needs to be built together and shared, but it also needs to be leveraged to affect systems change and reinforcement? Yes, please.
Oh gosh, these are all such good questions, and they're things that we grapple with all the time in our own work. Okay, so another thing that we're really learning in our research work is that so power sharing occurs in many ways, and I just talked about one common way, which is material, structures, sharing decisions, sharing money, that kind of thing. But what we also are finding is that partnerships who engage in regular reflection processes are in fact, that drives most of outcomes. We call it empowering processes. But when partnerships actually sit down and do structured reflections on what's going on in the partnership, they regularly engage in trust building exercises. They build authentic relationships. They have conflict. When partnerships actually have conflict that they mediate and work through, they build more authentic power sharing. So that would be an imperfect answer, but one way to think about how do you share power, not only just through resources, but through discursive practices. And what we're finding is that collective reflection is a very key part of this process. And what we mean by collective reflection is not just feeling good about each other and getting along, but it's also about doing a lot of deeper work about the structural circumstances that are being played out in actual research teams and having sustained dialogue and problem solving around that, if that answers your question. That's a whole other topic.
That is. So here's the agreement, then you've got to come back. But we're at time, and I want to respect that everybody else probably has other things in their calendar. Somebody pointed out to us that our follow-up survey, the link was wrong. So we have, the link is in the chat. It's up near the top. We will be sending it out by email. We will make sure it's accessible to everybody. Somebody noticed there was a bit of an error. in its accessibility. I want to thank Shannon so much for sharing her work with us today. It's been a brilliant connecting with her and being able to chat with her in the build up to this. And I also want to thank all of you for engaging in a great conversation today. If it's possible to show your video, everybody, you can turn your video off so poor Shannon can actually see all of the lovely faces of people that are actually still out there. Then we had 60 total participants today, so it was just lovely. We'll be sending out that brief evaluation survey for you to provide us some feedback from today, and Sinead's she's got that posted. This is the first talk in a long series that's going to unfold over the year. So please make sure that we'll be sending out more information, and please register. December 15th is the local partnership talk, which will follow up from this one. And we'll hear from Dr. Faye Fletcher and the Métis Settlements Life Skill Journey team when they're talking about some of the little P policies about their community university partnership with Métis Settlements over a decade of work. So that's going to be really interesting. Thank you so much to everybody. We're all done, and we'll send you back on your way, and we look forward to seeing everybody on December 15th. Thanks so much, guys, and stay well.
Thank you.
Thank you.